Set. So, Stan, thanks again for doing this. Let me start with kind of a brief introduction. You read the document, but let me start with a brief introduction. So, as you read, the National Center is working to provide new scholars with information about how to do intensive intervention.
Right.
And they've learned a couple ways of thinking about intensive intervention, one of which is data-based individualization, which you may be familiar with. I believe you've heard of that. So they've learned DBI quite a lot, and we've been trying to introduce them to some other ways of thinking about it. So, for example, one other approach they learned about was using mastery measurement, and another approach they learned about was using single case designs for behavior. In this module, what Doug and I are trying to do is to talk to folks like yourself about other ways to think about intensive intervention. And one sort of dimension of that we highlighted was this sort of idiopathic nomothetic distinction. And you know, the idea behind DBI is very sort of idiopathic, right? It's sort of like individualizing for children for whom, you know, lots of different kinds of instruction haven't worked. And that's a great thing to do. It's the core of intensive intervention. But many researchers in special education do work that isn't designed in that way. People design interventions for larger groups of kids. And so we were, you know, reflecting on that and thinking, like, how do we think about that in the context of intensive intervention? When you design a curriculum that's not individualized to a specific kid, like, is that a form of intensive intervention, and why might we think of it that way? So does that give you a decent background?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. So then, so I'm going to ask you the questions as we've written them, but don't feel confined to the questions. Feel free to say anything else you'd like to. I think the scholars will really enjoy hearing your perspective. So, so we're thrilled to have you. All right.
I'm glad to be here. I appreciate it. There's always a certain degree of honor in being asked one's opinion, so I'm glad to do this.
Great. Well, thanks again. So first question is, would you characterize your work as taking an idiopathic or nomothetic approach to designing and implementing interventions for students with disabilities?
Yeah, as most people would say, I suppose the apparent approach is idiographic in that the focus is always on individual student performance and on tailoring or modifying instruction in ways that provide successful improvement for individual students, and that might be quite unique and distinctive for that student rather than something that works for most of the kids most of the time. So at that level, at least, it seems quite obviously idiographic, but if you start at a slightly different point, you just want to think more academically about it, the intervention approach really starts with the idea that, and our research began with the idea that it would be possible to identify key indicators of individual student growth that were common across individuals. And so if you take the most obvious case in point, which is oral reading, the measure of oral reading that we did research on and developed at the University of Minnesota was assumed to be applicable across individuals, common to all individuals. Think of nomothetic as being looking for generalization or findings applicable across individuals. It's, in that instance, extraordinary that the oral reading score has become widespread in its use. I just discovered today, thanks to a coincidental meeting with Amanda Vanderheyden, that the USAID now has a website in which one can find oral reading data on students all over the world. And so we think, okay, this is an ideographic approach. On the other hand, the start point for the intervention was, I guess, nomothetic. It wasn't that we were looking for data that would be different from one individual to the next. It would be common to all individuals.
Right.
But then the idea was we're going to build off of that with the key element or component of an intervention for students who are having difficulty would be the teacher. And the teacher would then be responsive to the data on individual student progress and individual student growth. So now we have to ask a question as to whether or not the intervention techniques or the instructional methods that teachers might design and use for students would be ideographic or nomothetic within the framework of the data-based instruction approach. And I suppose it might be better to think about that as being ideographic rather than nomothetic. So what might work for one teacher with one student might not necessarily work for another student with the same teacher or with another teacher, even with the same student. So the I think truly ideographic nature of data-based instruction at the level of intensive intervention, at least, is probably the teacher and the differences between teachers and methods that teachers might design. I could go on, of course, forever, but maybe, Devin, you'd like to say something or ask me something?
I mean, I think this is exactly what the scholars want to hear. They want to hear you, not me. So, so they'll hear enough of me in this module, so they don't need to hear any more of me. The one thing I'll comment on is the interesting thing about that is, we talk about aptitude by, treatment interaction. This is sort of like a student by teacher interaction, sort of an interesting way of kind of characterizing it. I'll give you a chance to kind of go back to this a little bit later if you want to. Let me go on to the second question. Has your research changed the way you think about the students you've studied? Here we're thinking about a quote from Yuri Bronfenbrenner. I can't remember how to say it. This is Doug. The best way to understand something is to try to change it. And the idea here is, you get a better feel for the kinds of kids that you're working with and at a finer grained level, the actual challenges that they have. So has that changed over time, the way you think about the kids as a result of the work you've done?
It's probably hardened my belief that the unpredictable nature of interventions, hardened my belief in the unpredictable nature of interventions, so that while we might have data on a method that seems to work for a substantial number of students or produce more improvement, our research has so often resulted in students moving in different directions when a common method has been applied. So you collect data and you look at individual student growth, and you might find that one student seems to benefit significantly from the interventions, the changes that are occurring, whereas the same teacher working with another student at the same time might find instead that the student is not progressing, not improving as a result of the same interventions. So I guess it's increased my belief that it's absolutely essential for teachers to collect data on individual students. We once did, Doug Marston and I in the Minneapolis Public Schools did a study, and Ann Casey was the research assistant at the time. We did a study where we had teachers work together designing interventions in groups of, let's say, 4 or 5 teachers working together to set up a peer tutoring program, or set up a program using direct instruction, or a program that focused more on incentives, motivation, consequences, or something. So you'd have a group of 3 or 4 or 5 teachers all implementing the same method or intervention, and then getting back together again and sharing their data on individual student performance. And when they got together to look at the data, of course, they found not only differences between teachers in terms of the outcomes, but differences within teachers and between students. And so the teachers who started out to be fairly certain that the interventions were going to be effective wound up being more suspended in their judgments about whether interventions would be more effective. And we actually collected data on the certainty of their beliefs about the effectiveness of intervention, and found out, as they taught the students and found out that those students didn't all benefit from their instruction in the same way, they became more cautious or thoughtful and reflective on what methods might work for students. And that was really important to me and to us, because I had thought that if teachers are going to really be problem solvers and try to develop unique intervention programs, they have to not be wedded to certain ideas about what will work with students, that they need to be open-minded about possibility that what they're going to try isn't going to work very well, and they need to be thinking about alternatives. So it seems to me, in the framework of your question about, has our research or our work led us to any different kinds of conclusions, or any conclusions as a result of trying to change kids' programs and see what happens? I think definitely, I guess we believe that if teachers are going to be successful, they're going to have to try to change kids' performance, but see that those changes don't always work all the time, and be open and flexible. Unfortunately, I think people too often get wedded to a method and believe it. They don't want to change. So progress monitoring data becomes sort of secondary to the idea that, well, I have to use this method and so forth. And yes, I'll collect the data, but I won't really be responsive to the data. So.
Right. In a way, it's sort of you've got a better sense of teachers as well as students, right? Like you've changed the way you're thinking about teachers a lot.
Well, yeah. Because you go back then to the question of what's the intervention in database instruction, and the intervention is, in my view, is a creative, problem-solving oriented teacher, and those teachers need to be trained and have experience in what is required to do individual database problem solving.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for that, Stan. So next question. Could the interventions you've designed be applied successfully to students without a need for intensive intervention?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Of course, in fact, again, it depends on how you think about what the database instruction approach is. Your comments earlier about what a nomothetic approach is, it seems to me that the only reason you work toward group interventions or group treatments is almost exclusively economic efficiency or something like that. in order to
Right.
conduct programs, it costs money, and you can't always do the things that you would like to do because you just don't have the resources to do it. So I guess in my case, rightly or wrongly, I've always assumed that almost the best possible situation is where you have a teacher who can work closely with a student to help that student learn, but it's kind of a one-to-one relationship where that's improbable or unlikely in the general education program. And even if you think about an RTI program and you talk about levels of intervention or levels of treatment, that the initial levels are instituted not because they're instituted not because you think they're the most intensive or best things you could possibly do, but they're the ones that are feasible within the framework of a general education program, where you have certainly at level 2 or whatever it's called.
Tier 2, secondary prevention.
Tier 2, that you have. You try to create the best possible situation for working with a group of students. So the individual database instruction program, which was what we designed at first, doesn't generalize to that level because you don't have one teacher working with one student. On the other hand, the key component, the data collection and progress monitoring, which is a vital element of the database approach, does, to a greater degree, does generalize to the general ed classroom or to Tier 2, so that progress monitoring data can be collected and people can be responsive if they would be responsive to the data, and take the time to do that and design and redesign programs. And that's, I'm sure, what a good RTI model is all about, what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what goes on all the time, but I think that's, at least conceptually, that's what the RTI model is about. So
yeah.
So that's, I guess, if you think about the approach that we work toward, it does one-to-one individual problem solving doesn't generalize well to the, but other aspects of the model do, the formative evaluation of students, less frequent progress monitoring, and so on.
That's great. Okay. As we learn more about cognition and human development, do you expect the field of special education will move more in an idiographic or nomothetic direction in the design and implementation of our interventions?
Yeah, I've thought about that a bit, and it seems to me that you don't move to more let's see. It seems to me that the model that we really have, it's almost inevitable, is one where you try to find treatments or interventions that work when other treatments or interventions don't work very well. I can't help but think in a medical context, for example, where someone comes in with a serious illness and there might be an array of alternatives, but there are the standards, the ones that people think might work best. And so those are implemented first, and that is to the extent that it's feasible economically to do that. And then if those treatments don't work, then you try to consider the alternative treatments that have been tried and maybe haven't worked with as great a number, but have worked with a number for whom the original treatment didn't work. And so what we need to do, it seems to me, is to build an array of treatment alternatives that a teacher can consider, and and then in some scheduled way or success, in terms of successive interventions, try those alternatives because the data indicate that those alternatives can work. They might not. Like the first alternative you would hope would be the one that worked best for the most.
Right.
But you might have a second alternative that worked well for some, but in an unpredictable way. And I guess that's partly the ATI aspect of it, is if you could figure out with your research that somehow initial grouping of individuals would allow you to use different treatments for different individuals or groups of individuals who share common characteristics. That would be ideal. But my guess is you're always going to get to this a point where you've done those things, which are more nomothetic, and then you are to a point where I don't know what. There aren't any alternatives that I know that are obvious, at least, to try this with this child. But I know that sometimes a very creative teacher working effectively with an individual student can come up with some individual treatments that really make a difference.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of a lip service. You know, we hear it over and again that the most important person in education is the teacher. And we really can't set that aside, it seems to me, that ultimately in important ways, the teacher is going to be the most significant element in any intervention program that you establish. I can imagine that you might have a very effective intervention doesn't let's see, a particular teacher doesn't do it very well, or it doesn't work very well for that teacher, you know. And even though the intervention data are good for the intervention itself in general, so you're looking, I think, nomothetically. I think a lot of our research is probably going to be nomothetic, and that we're going to be having to look for some sort of ways of differentiating between individuals and finding treatments that might work for different groups of individuals, but recognize that ultimately we're talking about individual students and what might work for them, and it's unpredictable again. So it's hard for me to predict what direction research will be going, but it seems inevitable we'll just be constantly looking for treatments that work across groups of kids. So there's that generalizability and the nomothetic nature. But knowing that ultimately we're going to have to work with individuals in unique ways.
Yeah. Well, so one comment one of the other folks we talked to had was that, you know, in terms of the nomothetic approach, there are only so many ways to, you know, do something, to read, for example, and that a nomothetic approach makes sense in some cases because, you know, there's only so much you can do to change an intervention to be responsive to different aspects of reading, particularly beginning reading. You know, you've got your phonological awareness kinds of stuff and so on, that it, you know, there's a limit to how much change you could actually make.
I'm sure there's a limit, but I guess I think, you know, early on when we developed a data-based intervention approach, we created what was called the instructional plan, and it had a set of columns on it. And the columns had headings like time allocated, materials used, teacher-student ratio, and at least one on motivation used, and so on. So if you just think of those column headings, for example, then what we tried to get people to do was think about variation within each of those columns. How much time is being allocated in reading or to reading, and within reading, how much time is being allocated to word recognition, how much time to decoding, much time, what materials are being used and what might be used, and to what extent, and then similarly, what was the grouping arrangement? Was it 1-to-1, 1-to-2,
Right.
1-to-5, and so forth? And then the so often overlooked area of motivation, what really was being done to take a kid who was has a history of failure or lack of success at the very least. What was being really done to turn that kid on and get him engaged? There were so many instances where kids learn away from their teacher if they're motivated to learn to do something to get good at it. So anyway, the point of that instructional plan was to think about all the variations within those column headings, and I'm not sure that I'm remembering all of them.
Sure.
To get people to think about all the different things that could be changed or altered. And I guess I think there might be a lot more than people think about if they open the box a little bit more to think about what some of the variables are that are involved.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's sort of, I mean, what I think I hear you saying is there's sort of all these almost micro changes teachers need to make to their instruction that have something to do with being responsive to the student, but are very much about the instructional context and very little about, sort of understanding the cognitive processes of the student, and that there's a lot that rests in teacher decisions that is going to affect students more than us understanding the kid has a working memory deficit or something like that.
Well, yeah, of course, that's what I think, and I think that the approach that we were advocating and have advocated, the database instruction approach, its primary weakness has been that we assumed that we could develop master teachers, I think, who would have an incredible array of skills and competence. We tried to set up such a resource teacher program at the University of Minnesota that I worked on for years, and had some success with it, I thought, but it was clear and has become clear to me that the model of database instruction that rests heavily on the master teacher is one that's been hard to implement. That most of what we get in the schools are teachers who have sort of basic training in their educational programs, and some are more competent and more experienced than others and so forth, but they aren't quite the master teachers that I thought might be in the heart of a database instruction program.
Yeah. That's great. So what areas would you regard as what areas of study would you regard as very important and very understudied?
Well, actually, I just alluded to one, and you'll probably be surprised in that. I think motivation. I just think that it's at least half the game when you're working with
half the game. You think it's that much?
At least. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't
Kid's
know.
not motivated. What are you going to do, right?
I mean, if you're trying to get a kid to learn to play the piano, the biggest problem you have is getting them to sit down and really work at and practice and playing the piano. He can learn to play the piano, but he's got to work at it and stay engaged in it. And there's a lot of, I don't think we talk about it very much anymore, but there's sort of a lot of research on like helplessness, let's say. We're talking about kids who don't think they're going to be able to learn. They have a history of like they can learn. So now I come up, in what we do, we focus so much on the front end of what kind of methods or techniques are we going to implement, nice, clear, structured, direct instruction and repeated practice and so forth. But, if the kid's just going through the motions and he's not really trying to learn, doesn't really think he's trying to learn, it seems those, that what's the motivational theory about all those self-attributions and so forth.
Right.
I'm smart or I'm not smart. I can't learn this because I'm dumb and so on.
Yep.
And I'm thinking more, in terms of, and I've always, Devin, I've always thought about kids who were kind of at the bottom end of the distribution in terms of learning. I've been a special educator all my life, and so I'm not talking about kids in the middle of the distribution, although that would, I suppose, apply equally well. I don't know what the reinforcers are for kids in the middle of the distribution all the time, but so one area I just feel like, and I think some people who know me probably get tired of me saying it, but one area that I think is understudied is how best to help teachers figure out good motivational programs and the little things that we learned in point systems and all that stuff. That kind of works, but not much, I don't think. It's a little bit like saying good work, good work, good work each time. You're right. That kind of feedback. I don't think it does anything. I think you've got to figure out some other way that it becomes important for kids to learn. And you hear a lot of stories about kids really learn to read on their own when they got a book that they just loved and they want, they took it all went in their bedrooms and they worked at it, even though they were crummy readers. And eventually, they got into it. That's a really big thing. It's like me in golf, the extent that I think I can improve my score, I'll work at it, but after a while my game goes to pot if I don't think I'm getting any better.
Right.
I don't work at it anymore. I don't go to the range and practice and so on. So that's one area where I think a lot could be done. And then, of course, the other area that I don't know that we worked at it very hard goes back to my master teacher notion, which has to do with studying teachers who seem to be more effective more of the time. What is it that they're doing that enables them to be more effective more of the time? Of course, research like that requires that you have some way of determining who those teachers are, and then focusing on what they do and doing research with them and examining how they think about what they're doing, and so it's the cognitive research that needs to be done to some extent is on teachers thinking about it. It's not on kids thinking so much. So those are probably the two biggest areas that I think about. I'm skeptical about the extent to which we will come up with some, as we folks thought, like phonological awareness was the magic bullet for kids with learning disabilities, right. And it's turned out not to be true. I mean, it's an important thing, it's an important component, but it doesn't solve the problem. But there was a time when everybody believed that now we'd finally figured out what it was going to unlock the key. That was the key to unlock the LD kids' failure to learn. So I'm skeptical that we will find things like that. And, it might be that somewhere down the line people are going to develop methods of neurological study that'll get into kids' heads. But I doubt it even there. I'm a little bit more like B.O. Skinner, who thought that if we ever figured out what was going on inside the kids' heads, it would look more like an old telephone switchboard with lots of input and output, and wouldn't really change what had to go in and what had to go out, and what came out on the other end. So I just there have been a lot of really smart people who work really hard on different methods or techniques for kids, and they're people you work with.
Yeah.
And so, and it hasn't been, it's not obvious what those avenues yet unexplored might lead us to success. I think about cancer treatment, and I think about all the money and all the effort that's gone into research on different types of cancer, and we make progress, but it's just incredibly difficult to solve the problem completely so that we don't have it anymore.
Right.
And I think that's probably the same thing. That same thing is true about kids in schools.
Yeah, and the amount of R&D we do in in education is far less than we do in cancer research. So interesting. Yeah. So two more things. The last question is, what papers or other resources would you recommend the scholars access to better understand this topic?
I thought about it, Evan, and to be honest with you, I don't really have an answer for it. I know I guess I once wrote a paper that got at some of what we've talked about today that appeared in Journal of Special Education. I can't even remember the title of it. Doug Fuchs would probably find it.
Yeah, we can find it.
He actually invited me to make the presentation and write the paper. So I guess I don't have anything to offer in that regard.
Okay. Well, you contribute.
What have others offered? Maybe if you could prompt me a little bit, it might help me think about that. Other ideas and other people's suggestions?
People have gone a lot of directions with it. Lee Swanson recommended reading a meta-analysis, which may not surprise you. We had, what have other people said? I'm trying to think. I think people just kind of chosen pieces that they thought summarized an area of work that was of interest to them. I can't offhand think of. Deb Simmons recommended a paper she did with Mike Coyne about how you could shorten interventions, or you could adapt interventions by giving kids more or less time and changing group size and so on, and sort of idiopathic, nomothetic ways of doing things, sort of like individualizing in some ways, but still within a group setting. So that was a paper like that. I think we had at least one person recommend an academic, another sort of we had Marcia Barnes too, and I can't remember what she recommended, but I think it's just sort of any piece that you think would give them a fresh perspective or help them think about this differently. I mean, you've made a really good case for a couple of things. I mean, one is obviously, the idiopathic nature of a lot of the work we do. And I think, what you presented was really convincing in that way. The other piece of it, I think that's important to highlight, and so if there's a paper you could think of that did this, is a part about teachers. And that, you really put this very strong emphasis on teacher expertise and how, I think that's sort of like, we said kind of several times in the conversation, it's like, we need to understand teachers' cognitive processing or something, where, there's so much about the teacher that maybe that's the important unit of analysis. And so if there's anything that you've written or other people have written about, the role of teachers in designing and implementing interventions that, could be data-based or could just be a summary or review or opinion, something like that would be great.
Okay, I'm not going to be able to do that off the top of my head.
That's fine.
But if I think of something, I'll certainly send it to you.
Absolutely. And you could send me just the reference or something, and we can find it too.
Right.
So the last thing is, and I'll edit out the section where, we were just chit-chatting about the articles, but the last thing is, these scholars are just finishing up their first year as doctoral students, and we're hoping, going to be the future of special education research and teaching new teachers. And so I know many of them, know your work because all of them know your work because, they've been doing this work this year to understand DBI. And I think they'd be really interested to hear the advice you have for their careers and for making a difference in special education for kids with disabilities.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I guess I think it's important to start out with a nomothetic approach to your research.
Wow, that was not what I expected to hear.
But what I mean by that is if you define nomothetic as looking for general principles or laws or
right,
then I think it's important to try to identify areas of work where you can do research that might produce generalizable findings. Just as I said at the outset of my discussion today with you, that I thought we started out with the idea that it would be possible to find indicators of growth in basic skills that would generalize across in kids, students. I think it's important to get hooked on particular problems or research questions,
right,
and not. The dilemma is always for, especially young professors, is the conflict between doing research because you can get funded for it, on the one hand, and doing research because you think the outcomes will be important in the long run. And more, at least before I retired, it seemed to me that more and more people were being seduced into doing research because they could get funded for that research, not because there was some basis for them thinking, if I do this research, it will lead me to answering certain questions that I think are really important in the field. And the problem for the young researcher then is, of course, that the institutions that they work in the universities and colleges reward them for bringing in grants.
Right.
And so they're almost inevitably drawn to doing research that they can get funded for, whether it's state funding or organization funding or whatever it is. So, if you can find problems that will sustain you and you can keep working at across time, I think you'll have a satisfying career. I think you might have a really good career if you get funded a lot and and publish a lot, and you can be a happy and successful person that way too. But I'm not sure that it advances the field in quite the same way that it would if you could figure out what the problems are to work on. If it just takes something like that, really figure out what makes teachers successful. Let's go after that one and say, okay, my career is going to be sustained by my interest and my efforts toward trying to understand that. And see, the agencies aren't necessarily going to come up with requests, grant proposals or requests for proposals on that topic. So there's a dilemma, and it's hard to do research if you don't have money and support to do that research. So believe me, I get it. I get it, but it's hard. That's a hard one.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that should pop into my head as the first thing to talk to or say to young scholars, but it does pop into my head. The other thing is, I had great success in my work because I thought my responsibility was to teach, train, educate graduate students in research and teaching. And so a lot of my early efforts in doing research were intended as opportunities for graduate students to learn to become researchers and to put them in a position to learn to become researchers. I think there are very often it happens that graduate students are paid as research assistants, but they just carry out specific jobs or tasks within the framework of a project, and they haven't really been part of a research project from its inception, the conceptualization of what the research questions are and the design of the research and the implementation and what you do in the midst of things when it's not going well and so forth. Most of the time now, it seems to me that the primary researchers who hold the grants, they do all the creative work, and that the graduate students have to do a lot of the work. And so, to the extent that you can look at your graduate students, when you become a professor, you look at your graduate students as maybe one of the most important parts of what you do in trying to train and motivate and increase the wealth of academic talent that we have in the field that can keep doing this kind of research. I think that's really important.
Great.
So those are the things that I guess I think about the most.
Fantastic. Well, Stan, thank you very much for your time. This is wonderful.